The first step in creating an Angular application, of course, is to lay out the structure of this app and especially plan which components you're probably going to need. Now, it's normal that whilst building the app, you decide to add another component which you didn't plan to add at the beginning, or maybe you decide that you can merge two components you thought you would have to split. But generally, this is still a good approach. And this should also show you how I approach this and how you may decide what should go into its own component and what can be merged into another one. So on this page, I try to lay out the general structure of our app. And at the bottom, you can find kind of a legend. So let's start with the features of this app. Well, we're going to have a shopping list and a recipe book section, as I said, managing either our single ingredients we need to buy or in the recipe book our whole recipes. Which components will we need for this? Obviously, a root component holding our overall application, the app component. Every Angular app has this. Then, since we have two sections, it probably makes sense to have some kind of header component where we can navigate between these two sections. Of course, you could also hard-code the header simply into the app component, but since it will contain its own business logic, in the end it will trigger a routing action later, and we will also add a drop-down there in the end, which allows us to store our recipes on the server and fetch them from there. So since we will have that logic attached to the header, outsourcing it into its own component makes sense so that we don't have to put all the logic into our root component, which really mainly should only be responsible for holding our overall app. So that is the header. Now let's dive into the individual features. Let's start with the shopping list. Here I guess it makes sense to have the overall shopping list component. Remember, the purple box is only the feature, so we need a component holding our shopping list. And maybe in this shopping list component, we also want to have a shopping list edit part, which allows us to add new items, so an input field and a button, because that again has its own logic. We will have to decide if we're editing an existing item or adding a new one. We need to submit this, so it makes sense to create its own component for this, so that we have our overall list component, mainly holding the data of the list, and the edit component being responsible for managing this data kind of, though the edit component will be nested inside the list component. I guess that's it for the shopping list. Let's have a look at the recipe book. Here, it certainly makes sense to have, again, just like with the shopping list, a recipe list component, which shows us a list of all our recipes. Here, we might later also put each individual recipe into its own item though, since it holds a little bit more information than just one line of HTML code. And a recipe detail area would be great too. So an area where once we select a recipe, we can see informations about that. Later in the course, we will also add another component here because we will then somehow need a component which allows us to edit existing recipes or add new ones. But since this is really advanced and we would not be able to fill it with much life right now, I will omit it for now and focus on the displaying part. So a list with items and then the detail section, which displays the details for the currently selected item. I guess this looks like a good plan. Each of these components should hold a significant amount of business logic, and I guess with the components sketched out here, we're really having each component focus on one main topic, displaying a list, displaying information about a single item, displaying detailed information about a selected item, and so on. So this is generally how I approach this. Of course, feel free to split this up even more, or if you want, merge them together as, for example, recipe list and a single item. But this will become more clear once we actually implement these components. Now, one last thing we should think about: which models will we use in this app? And with model, I simply mean which data. So we certainly will need some representation for our ingredient. We will use ingredients a lot in the recipe book too. Each recipe there has a couple of ingredients. So we should define how an ingredient looks like. That is something which your application probably also needs. Be clear about the data you're going to use and put it into its own class so that you have your own type you can use later on and that you have a clear interface or definition of what your data looks like so that you can easily have your components talk with each other, something we'll dive in later in this course, so that there is no issue regarding the data you're exchanging. So besides the ingredients, which probably is a very simple model, only controlling the name and amount maybe, we also will need a model for the recipe, which contains things like the title, the description, the ingredients, and so on. And I think with this, we have a solid plan for now. Let's get started. Let's implement all these components, fill it with some dummy data for now, and take the first step in building our course project.